Anyone who has tried to make a game has inevitably dealt with player confusion. You'll design a rule that you think is perfectly intuitive, only for your players to misinterpret it in a way that you didn't think was possible. Either that, or they'll have a question, stare directly at the part of the rulebook that answers their question, and then turn to you and ask, "Why didn't you answer this in the rulebook?" While it's impossible to eliminate all points of confusion from a game, there is a lot you can do to make your games less confusing. I broadly define these changes as 3 categories. There are rulebook changes, thematic changes, and mechanical changes. I'm going to go over rulebook changes first because they're often the least work to implement. One issue I've run into with my board game Musketeers, click the little I to see more about that, is confusion about the declare actions step of the turn. During the declare actions step, each player takes turns playing a card face down. When they do this, they also get to do certain optional actions like moving their character to an adjacent space, rotating their character, or placing a card on top of their deck. Each character gets one opportunity to do everything. Some people thought that activations alternated between players, so green would move, then purple would move, then green would rotate, then purple would rotate, etc. The main way that I addressed this was by adding an example of play on the opposite page. This example of play emphasizes how one player takes all of their actions before the other player does anything. The rules for the declare action step were also rewritten to emphasize this. So, examples of play are good, but I want to point out the importance of a good rulebook layout. Imagine if the example of play had been tucked away later in the rulebook so that players had to turn a page to see it. If that were the case, I think most people wouldn't have found that information when they needed it. A person who's already confused is not going to try and start absorbing more information about rules later in the book. They're going to stick to the page that they're stuck on. The end of a page and the end of a 2-page spread punctuates whatever rules you're writing. Having a rule split across 2 different pages is like having a period in the middle of your sentence. It's still readable, technically, but it disrupts your reading. This is especially true when you think about multiple players sharing a rulebook. 2 players can only read a book at the same time if they're looking at the same 2-page spread. Sometimes, splitting a rule across multiple pages is unavoidable, but if you can avoid it, you probably should. In some older versions of Musketeers, the steps of a turn were split across 2 pages. This was especially awkward since the example of play that I just talked about was stuck between these 2 pages. Thankfully, the current version of the rulebook doesn't have this problem due to the rules being simpler and the text being smaller. A game's theme is something that can make a game much easier to learn if it's used well, and much harder to learn if it's used poorly. When I say theme, I don't mean it in the literary sense. I'm not talking about what philosophical ideas the game is trying to demonstrate to the player. When I say theme, I'm talking about how Pokemon are little creatures instead of rows in a spreadsheet. I'm talking about how Donkey Kong has a person jumping over barrels instead of a rectangle jumping over other rectangles. A game's theming is about what the mechanics represent within the game's universe. Games have themes, in part because it helps them tell stories. If every Pokemon was replaced with a spreadsheet, it would be a lot harder to care about raising them. But themes also help teach a game's mechanics. Even if you've never played Pokemon, do you think that this Pokemon is more vulnerable to fire-type attacks or water-type attacks? It's more vulnerable to fire-type attacks. You probably guessed that because fire burns plants and water nourishes them. Pokemon's types are themed around things that are familiar to us in the real world, and the way that they interact in-game mirrors how they interact in the real world. Pokemon's types could have just as easily had no theme. You could replace water, grass, and fire with type A, B, and C. If you did this, it would be harder for people to learn the game because they can't use their real-world knowledge to make assumptions about how the game works. Assumptions are at the heart of why themes are useful and why they're dangerous. A game's theme suggests certain things about its mechanics. It encourages players to make certain assumptions. Of course fire is strong against grass, fire burns grass. But those assumptions must line up with the game's mechanics. If grass beats fire in your game, then not only are people going to be confused, they're going to be more confused than if you'd called them type A and type B. Before Musketeers was themed around, well, Musketeers, it was themed around gladiators. Players used to fight in a big, circular arena before I discovered that a small and narrow board led to more interesting gameplay. After I narrowed the board, a friend playtested the game and told me this doesn't make any sense. How can they be gladiators when it feels like they're fighting in a tiny alleyway? He was right. The theme didn't make sense anymore. The game's theme and mechanics had to line up, and changing the theme was easier than changing the mechanics. However, there are times when changing the theme is harder than changing the mechanics. The times when this happens tend to be when you've already spent a lot of time or money on your game's art early in the design process. I cannot emphasize this enough. Do not do this. As soon as you get nice art for something, it's going to kill you to get rid of it, even if that thing really needs to go. I've done this. Other people have done this. You should do everything in your power to avoid doing this. I am demanding that you procrastinate on getting art for your game. Okay? Okay. Rant over. The final way to make a game less confusing is to change its mechanics. In the past 2 months, pretty much every mechanic in Musketeers has changed. Many of these mechanics were removed at some point for being too complicated, and then being reinvented in a way that kept what made the mechanic interesting, while eliminating the thing that made the mechanic difficult to understand. This is best illustrated by the system for resolving action cards. This was a nightmare in early versions of the game, so I'm going to try to explain it as best as I can, and you can sit back. Don't worry if none of this makes sense, because it doesn't make sense. Initially, cards resolved in multiple simultaneous steps. The green space with the arrow indicates the player's starting position and direction. The blue spaces indicate movement, and the red spaces indicate attacks. If I played lunge attack, and my opponent played step, then we would both move forward 1 space simultaneously. After that, I would attack the area in front of me. This kind of makes sense so far, but the devil is in the details. What happens if my opponent is standing directly in front of me, blocking me from moving forward? Does my lunge attack miss them and hit the space behind them? That doesn't make a lot of sense thematically, but making the attack relative to the player's position after trying to move, rather than from their starting position, is also really complicated. Additionally, because 2 players can't occupy the same space, 2 players simultaneously trying to move into the exact same spot on the board caused all hell to break loose in the rulebook. If neither player gets the space, then you get super awkward situations where both players want to use a short-range attack, try to move towards each other, and they're both not able to do it, so no one hits anyone. I wanted to prevent this, so I made a long and convoluted set of checks that would hopefully allow one player to take up the space. This was bad. This was really, really bad. What made this system extra strange was that, in practice, the things that made it convoluted rarely mattered. People often didn't play cards that conflicted with one another. This was as much a negative as it was a positive, since it's harder to learn a rule that isn't relevant 95% of the time. That was especially true in this case, since players couldn't know ahead of time which turn the rule would become relevant. The good news was that the rule being mostly irrelevant meant that it was easy to remove it from the game. Resolving action cards was overhauled with the introduction of the initiative system. Under this system, the initiative token is passed from player to player each turn. When resolving cards, the player with the initiative token resolves everything on their card first. Then, the next player resolves everything on their card, and so on. No more simultaneous activations, and no more multi-step activations. For the 95% of turns where players didn't play conflicting cards, this system was identical to the previous system. But when cards did conflict, this system was significantly simpler. This was especially true for people trying to move into the same space on the same turn. Under the initiative system, the player with the initiative got there first, and everyone else got blocked. That said, the system still had room for improvement. Under the old system, cards that let you block or move always resolved before attacks. This allowed players to block or get out of the way before an attack hit them. Under the new system, those cards needed special rules text specifying that they resolved early. If they didn't have this text, then they became practically useless on turns where you didn't have the initiative. This was solved with a simple change. A keyword called quick was added, represented by this little bird icon. A new step was also added to the turn order where quick cards were resolved before all other cards. If multiple attack cards are in play, you could once again resolve them in initiative order. And, since none of the attacks in the game are quick, cards that are quick will always resolve before attacks. So, to review, card resolution went from a system where players go back and forth between multiple cards, resolving their individual steps, to a system where cards that needed to go first are clearly marked to go first, and everything else goes second. Additionally, resolving conflicting simultaneous actions went from a large set of niche rules to following the initiative token, a token that players were already using to track other parts of the game. I think that the general importance of the initiative token is very key to this system working. If it was only relevant in the 5% of turns where cards conflict, then players would probably forget to pass the token to their opponents each turn. Instead, the initiative token is constantly relevant because it's tied to things like who gains energy this turn and who has to move first this turn. It's like the game design equivalent of a keyring. If you don't think about something for months, then you might have trouble finding it when you actually need it. But if you put that item on a keyring, and there's a key on that ring that you use every day, you'll never lose the item because you'll have the keyring on you all the time. I think there are a couple lessons to be learned here. One lesson is that there are multiple paths to achieving the same design goal, and that exploring alternate paths can be worthwhile if our initial design is convoluted or unintuitive. Another lesson is that game design is a series of expansions and contractions. It's trying out a bunch of things that could lead to cool gameplay, cutting out all of the bloat that doesn't actually lead to anything interesting, and then repeating the process by seeing what you can build on top of the things that actually worked. In the case of Musketeers, the second expansion came in the form of Accelerate. Remember when I said that attacks can never be quick because cards like Block need to resolve before them? Well, Accelerate allows you to make your next card quick. This creates situations where a player who plays Accelerate and then gets the initiative token can hit an opponent with an attack before they get a chance to block. Without the initiative system, this card couldn't exist. The rules text on it would be too complicated. Without quick actions, it would be too confusing to be worth adding. So, this was a longer video. Thank you for watching. And if you're curious about Musketeers and you haven't already seen the first video, go watch that.